Welcome to the ATP project. We've got hosts and stuff, and today we're talking about vitamin B12. So I've got Elizma and Steve as the experts because I'm not really with it at all today. No. So we're going to talk about B12s and all the other forms of cobalamins. We're going to talk about the absorption, things that might stop the absorption. Where do we get it from? Once it's in our body, what does it do? How do I know if I need it? And if I need it, how do I fix it? Does that sound about right?
Yeah,
that covers most of it.
Sounds perfect.
So let's go back to the start. What's B12?
Well, its chemical name is cobalamin, and there's different forms. There's methylcobalamin, cyanocobalamin, which means cyanide and cobalamin, and this story contains a lot of arsenic and cyanide, the story of B12, but it actually goes back 3.8 billion years ago with the prokaryotes.
Shit, I did my way too early.
Yeah.
Let's go. Back 3.8 billion years ago. Tell me about your prokaryotes.
Yes, well, they are the oldest form of life, and they use B12 to survive. So they were the first use of B12. 3.8 billion years ago.
It's true. What'd they do with it?
Oh, they used it to live and suck in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, which dropped the CO2 levels, pumped out carbon dioxide. Oxygen, which made life on Earth possible.
Yeah, right, huh?
There you go.
Well, that's handy. So B12 is relatively important.
Relatively important. But 1824 is when the first case of anemia, pernicious anemia, was actually recognised.
When?
1824.
1824. Isn't it?
Yeah.
Because there's people with this weird anemia.
Yeah.
Because they looked at their, with the old Pasteur microscope, they saw their red blood cells were too large.
Yeah.
And they had this weird sort of, and they didn't know what it was, of course, and they had extreme fatigue. And the first treatment of it was actually in 1915.
So macrocytosis is what they write on the blood cells for large red blood cells.
Yep.
And so the reason why they go large, we talked about in the iron podcast, if you don't have enough raw materials to make new ones, they recycle the old ones. And every day they get a little bit bigger. And when they get to a certain size, they pretty much become useless. Yeah. The problem is if you measure your blood, it often will still show that you've got the nutrients that you need in those blood cells. So sometimes it's a really good idea to have a look on the blood test for the size of the red blood cells. And what's that? That's the MCV number.
MCV, mean corpuscular volume.
Yeah. So that so the average volume, which basically, and the corpuscular sounds like a flash word for cells and that. So so the average size of the cells within your bloodstream gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and that's a sign of B12 deficiency.
Should be about 77.
Yeah, right. What?
The size should be about 77. That's what you look for in a blood test in Australia.
Well, that's the minimum, right?
The minimum's about 72, and then the maximum is about 80. So around 77 is a good size.
Yeah, right. But doesn't that ranges change depending on the pathology labs and that sort of stuff?
To the ranges of
the 90s and that sort of stuff.
70 to 99 or 100.
Yeah, and if they're all at the top end.
73 to ADL FLs, so that's the reference range.
So a big MCV number means big old cells.
Yep.
And that's an indication that you're missing something to make new ones.
Yes.
Yeah, right. And if you get really little ones, it's called macrocytosis, which is an indication that for some reason you've lost a heap of blood and you're making all fresh new stuff. So, cool. Yeah. So B12, so we've got B12's found in foods. So we're going to talk about some natural, so you can get synthetic and you get synthetic forms of these vitamins because typically when they go through and, like you talked about bloody 3.8 billion years ago when you first saw it in a cell, Steve.
I was around.
And then we're talking about in the 1800s where again you saw it under your shitty little microscope as a big cell. We didn't always have the technology or the ability to extract B12s out of things for the purpose of studying them. So that's when we get into the habit of making synthetic forms. So it's easier to make a synthetic form for the purpose of studying what happens with B12, in certain situations. So what we find is the synthetic forms are, what are they? They're the cyanocobalamin and hydroxycobalamin. And we've got the methyl and the adenosocobalamin are the natural forms.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, the food.
That's right.
Yeah, no, those two forms form two different functions in the body, very distinctive.
Well, you got some cool flowcharts over here, Elizma, talking about the functions of these B12s and where they go. And I know you as a naturopath, when I first met Elizma, I think I was sitting in the audience watching Elizma present to a whole room full of doctors, educating them on methylation and that sort of stuff and talking about the MTHFR. I had to pause then. I mean, it is so hard not
really
to
think
swear.
about it.
The MTHFR, methylene tetrahydrofolate reductase, and all that sort of rubbish. And everyone was talking about folates and methylfolates. So I want to talk about like methylcobalamins and I want to know these natural forms of B12. What do they do in our body?
So, like Stephen said, you get those four, and both the cyanocobalamin and the hydroxycobalamin need to be converted into these active forms, methylcobalamin or adenosylcobalamin, in order to do its functions.
And the cyano is cyanide, hey?
Yeah, it's cyanide. So, there's some will say, well, the amount is too little to make a difference. But the fact is that cyanide does interfere with the energy production in cells and things like that. So
big time.
that's. Yeah, so I personally do not like the synthetic cyanocobalamin, but unfortunately that's a form you see in fortified foods pretty much, predominantly.
Because the synthetics are so much cheaper to make. They're also very stable. And that they say they've got good shelf life, good stability. They often handle cooking and things that would normally destroy acidity and all that sort of stuff, which makes them measurable in a finished product.
Yeah.
In our body, they're also measurable, but are they functional?
Exactly.
Is the question, because we can measure them in our blood, but we can't necessarily assess how effective they are. So there's a big difference. And before we go, it's important for people to understand the difference between bioavailability and bio efficacy.
Absolutely.
Because bioavailability is like filling in a timesheet. You can show that you were there, but did you achieve anything at that time? That's what we're talking about, bioefficacy.
Yeah.
So a lot of people use the bioavailability to say, I can show it was there, show it moved, and therefore it's there.
Yeah.
But doesn't mean it did anything.
Absolutely.
Yes. Fantastic study. We'll talk about later about veganism, about that.
Thanks, Steve.
Yep.
So I'll quickly illustrate where B12 kind of fits in. Now, looks very scary and complex little cycles here. Stephen got this one printed off for me, and this. Oh, let me just see here.
You just
that's
said
what I'm
that to
looking at.
nag in, didn't you?
No, I printed it off myself.
No, you
my
did.
God.
I printed one off for
You
Brooklyn
did.
too.
Big one.
She
Didn't
goes-
care.
She
I
just
saw
loves all
that.
this stuff.
So right there, that's the MS stands for methionine synthase complex, and as you can see, B12 is a cofactor there. But in that specific area, it is needed as the methylcobalamin form. So this is where B12 will be converted by specific proteins and enzymes into the methylcobalamin. Then this is not on the cycle completely. But if we look down there, where cystathionine is converted into cysteine, there's an enzyme there called CTH, which I can't remember what the long name is for. And I'm going
Cystathionine beta synthase.
Sorry, I just spat on my microphone.
So I'm going to move on to this cycle that
it's
explains
cystathionine
a little
beta
bit more.
synthase, if you want.
There you go. And it is there, and as you can see, again, it converts, or it kind of like goes more into the Krebs cycle, where it's involved in turning methyl malonyl CoA into succinyl CoA, and that also needs a vitamin B12 there, but that is in the adenosyl B12 form. So they're in different forms depending on where they kind of like exert their function.
And they've got so many functions, hey? So with the B12, I mean, a lot of it is energy production pathways through the Krebs cycle, you're saying. Well, the methylcobalamin form, is that to do with methionine? How do you say it? How do you say it? And how do I say it? I don't know.
I say
never
methyl.
know. No, the methionine.
I used to say methionine.
Yeah, methionine.
Oh,
What do
wow.
you say? Because you're cool. You read a lot of
Methionine.
stuff and then just make up words. I love it.
Methionine, but
At one stage, I was calling it methionine. So the cool thing is, we've nailed this thing. All of us just do a lot of reading, and we have no friends to talk to about this stuff.
I
So
love
during this
Elizabeth's way of
podcast, we
pronouncing
often come across. I like yours,
how did
ironically.
you say it?
Methionine.
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 Because methyl is a
You
group.
sound like a superhero.
English is not my first language.
No, I
thank
know,
you
but I
very-
like your way better.
So we're looking at B12's highly involved in methylation processes because it builds the enzymes?
Well, the B12 in that methionine synthase complex takes homocysteine, which is a typical marker for cardiovascular disease,
It's a waste.
diabetes.
It's an acidic waste that degrades things.
That's right. So it takes that homocysteine. You use methylcobalamin or methyl B12 as a cofactor, and it turns it into methionine or methionine. And then that goes on to form SAMe, which is the universal methyl donor in our biochemistry. It donates methyl groups to our RNA, our DNA, lipids. And
So it can turn a waste product that will break down our arteries and contribute to heart disease, damage our kidneys, damage the oily structures in our brains associated with Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, because just this acidic waste that degrades and oxidizes things. Using B12, you can convert that waste into an antioxidant, SAMe's got a reputation of antidepressant, anti-anxieties, and
breaks
all of these
down
things.
estrogen,
And then
estrogen
antioxidants,
Makes all your
detoxification
neurotransmitters.
out of a waste.
Yeah.
So that's what I love about the human body. Like, we can actually convert a waste product into something that we need, and that's the beautiful thing about the human body.
Yeah.
So that's how it works in the methylation. So, and also with fatigue. But what about red blood cells? It also it's involved in the production of red blood cells.
Definitely involved in the production of red blood cells, also through that succinyl-CoA system. We often forget about that because where that adenosyl B12 converts methylmalonic acid, methylmalonyl-CoA.
Methylmalonic acid is what I say, but that's all right.
Into succinyl-CoA.
Yeah.
That succinyl-CoA actually, with glycine and other nutrients, vitamin B6, it's involved in the production of hemoglobin. So B12 is involved in is very much involved in the production of healthy red blood cells.
So in an oat test, I did it again. In the organic acid test or the oat test, I can't not say test at the end of this thing.
No, there's no one knows.
So you piss in the
oat,
cup,
like
and they measure the methylmalonic acid. The elevated methylmalonic acid is an indication of B12 deficiency.
Yes, because that methylmalonic acid is not converted into succinyl-CoA, and it doesn't enter that Krebs cycle.
And that contributes to the fatigue associated with the B12 deficiency.
And that blood test is the most accurate B12 blood test with homocysteine. Because if you have...
They never want to measure homocysteine, eh? So you're saying homocysteine, methylmalonic acid,
yes.
Look for macrocytosis.
Yes,
and
they're
that
the
sort of
three.
stuff.
They're the three.
You
Don't look for B12 because it's misleading. Believe it or not, it sounds weird. You want to test for B12, you don't look for B12.
And is it a similar sort of scenario to like when you're looking for signs of iron deficiency? By the time your blood does not have some, the rest of your body's got none.
Yeah.
Because if you're giving nutrients to other parts of your body instead of building blood, you're going to die. There's no point in having a detoxification process if you don't have enough blood. Yeah. So that's the last thing to change shape. But also, you talked about your crappy microscopes in the 1800s.
1824,
that time you did that. So there is also another issue with measuring cobalamins, is that they don't actually have they do, but they don't use the technology to differentiate between the different forms of cobalamin. Right. Because we've mentioned 4 really useful... I just held up 3 fingers in for the people. So we mentioned 4... Man, I really need B12 today. So we've mentioned 4 forms of cobalamin that are available in supplementation. 2 of those forms are methyl and which is the other one? I forget. The adenosine. They're all found in foods as well. But there's also, they can get broken down and destroyed into other derivatives that are still cobalamins. And they still get measured and tested as cobalamins.
They do.
And then that same test is what they do to measure cobalamin in our blood.
Yeah.
So they can actually show high levels of cobalamin in the blood, but it may be a form of cobalamin or B12 that our body cannot use because it's already destroyed. Yeah. Typically the form that's found in plants, like spirulina and algae. So in the olden days, they went through with Steve's crappy microscope and measured B12 in these spirulinas and that sort of stuff and said, there's a heap of cobalamins in here. It's probably one of those. Then they went through and told everyone, this is a good plant source of those cobalamins, you should eat it. But the problem is they didn't know it was the form of cobalamin our body couldn't use at that time, but they still use that same method of technology. So what I'm saying is if someone's out there using a plant source of cobalamin, manifesting with all of these symptoms of B12 deficiency, They go get a blood test. The blood test says your vitamin B12 levels are fine. Because the blood test doesn't actually say cobalamin and along with its derivatives. It actually says vitamin B12 test.
Yeah.
And they do a vitamin B12 test on your blood, and they're measuring all forms of cobalamin.
Also the oxidized ones.
Yes.
Exactly. So
Well,
and they're dead.
It's even worse than that.
Tell me, worse.
Because let's say there was this is a paper done in the 90s where they gave kids heaps of spirulina.
Yeah.
And they gave kids fish and
So
they gave
in the
them
90s, that's like 20 to 30 years ago.
And they tested it. And what they found was, of course, their B12, I'll just pick the first one here. He was taking the RDA of B12, which is 2.7. The RDA is 2.4, so that's enough. Their B12 levels went from 130 to 378, which is fine. But their blood cell, their mean corpuscular volume increased dramatically. So it actually got worse.
So it showed their pernicious anemia to get worse.
Yes.
Using but the blood levels increase. So if they did nothing but just a blood test and
test,
totally ignored the
went up.
symptom picture and didn't look at any other parameters and only looked at the vitamin B12 results in the blood, they would think they were legends.
Correct. And with the other groups, the people fed fish, their B12 levels didn't even go up as much as the spirulina group, but their mean corpuscular volume dropped dramatically in the healthy range. So they actually got better.
So we're talking about the conversion again. So these dodgy forms of cobalamin, the oxidized forms, these damaged forms, the forms that are found in algae and spirulinas and a lot of the plant sources actually get absorbed because the intrinsic fact, we haven't got to the absorption stuff, which we will talk about in a sec, because that's the bit that confuses me the most. I've got a lot of questions around absorption. But so we're saying that this stuff uses the same transport as the normal B12, so it even competes with the B12 for absorption.
Yes.
Yeah.
Not only do that, I mean, their microbes compete like they only make them B12 for themselves. They don't care about us.
That's it.
So we compete with our microbes for B12, which they love because they're one of those carriote things you talked about.
Yep.
3.8 billion years ago. So,
Prokaryote.
God, he's old, that Steve. So we got to get this B12 in. So these dodgy forms of B12 that are found in these other plants and everything like that bind to those. They compete for absorption with the real B12, and then when they get into the blood, they basically jam up the ability to convert.
Correct.
Because a lot of these enzyme things, they got like shapes and things that fit in, and then it comes out the other side. But if it gets sucked in and it just jams it up, there's nothing else can be converted, and it backlogs. The same problems that we saw with synthetic folic acid, that we can get a high level of blood folate and actually have no folic acid effects if you can't convert it through, and it's significantly worse.
Oh yeah, it's the same sort of thing, and this is where we've got to be careful if you are treating a vegan that haven't got any animal products. So if they do have, and you have to measure the MCVs, the methylmalonic acids, and of course homocysteine.
But normally they'd be going to a doctor. They just do a quick. We're going to measure your B12, your folate, maybe your zinc, because we want to see if you're healthy, and then we do a full blood count. But then in the full blood count, unless something pops way out of range, it's not going to be mentioned. Unless it says macrocytosis at the bottom, they're not going to pull up that mean cell volume. So have a look and see where you sit within those ranges.
And I want to point something out while we're on the blood test and the mean cell volume. High doses of folate can mask megaloblastic anemia.
That's right.
And mask B12 deficiency.
That's right. So you can the MCV or the mean cell corpuscular volume can look normal in the presence of high folate supplements, but you still will be B12 deficient, and you'll still have all the neurological symptoms that can sometimes become irreversible if it carries on.
So what are they? Tell us. How do we know? So what are the neurological symptoms?
Typical, probably what a lot of people can identify with pins and needles. So pins and needles is a very big one. Obviously, later in life, it'll be things like dementia, Alzheimer's, memory issues, kind of like a lack of coordination. So anything where the brain has to communicate with the muscles or has to control things. So, being unsteady on your feet, maybe even tremors and things like that.
Because it's involved in the myelin sheath production as well. So that's the insulation. I always explain the myelin sheath like, if you imagine electric wire, the plastic coating is like the myelin sheath.
And it also reduces the speed of the neuron. So, of course, you don't get the nerve going there. So your brain tells your foot to move, and it moves a bit later. So they have this weird gait.
Yeah, right.
And this weird walk.
Does it actually, with the reflex thing on your knee, does it actually slow that down?
It slows that down,
What do they call that? Delayed reflex thing?
Yeah, the knee reflex.
Yeah, I used to love doing that. I had no idea why I did it, but I just used to do it.
You used to like bang people's knees.
Okay, see that? And then your foot move. And what are you diagnosing? I I don't know. This is my favourite part of uni.
All ulcers in the mouth and low energy.
Oh, and also
Yeah.
that, well, this is not necessarily
tongue.
neurological, but the tongue, you get this like red, swollen
Like glossitis,
tongue.
isn't it?
Yeah,
And it's like-
glossitis, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think the reason why I want to point that out, because what I see in my practice at least, is a lot of people sometimes, because of MTHFR and folate antibodies and things like that, do get put on humongous amounts of folate, like up to 50 milligrams of folate.
Yeah, I know.
sometimes.
And it's
So-
messed up. And the other thing that is a bad habit is overdosing B6. Big doses of B6. And
Yeah.
the side effects of overdosing B6 is pins and needles.
Pins and
Yeah.
needles.
So the problem is sometimes when you get these people come, they're manifesting some symptoms of B12 deficiency. One of the first things we should do is actually ask them about folate and B6, because sometimes they're on, what was it, FIFA protocol or something? There was these
Yeah,
dodgy old protocols with these mega doses.
The B6.
Yeah,
Not
Yeah,
mega
it's
doses
really
of
high.
B6 sometimes, but doesn't matter.
They
They were
often
using
mix
like
it.
they were using mega doses. Like I'm talking like 1.5, like 1,500 milligrams and stuff like that. And these people then they go and get the sublingual B12 because they're manifesting with B12 deficiency signs, which you can create with the overdosing of the folate and the overdosing of the
Disturbs
B6.
the balance, yeah.
Yeah, the inactive B6, the pyridoxine, knocks out the pyridoxal 5-phosphates, which causes
Yeah.
nerve damage.
Yeah,
and that's how
right.
it works. So if you take 1.5 grams of it, that definitely happens.
Yeah,
you get
exactly.
peripheral nerve things. People get nerve problems. It's terrible.
And there's a lot of it because then a lot of people feel the need to put B6 as a cofactor because it's involved in so many reactions. So you can actually have a look at your stack of supplements you got, and you'll just add up all your B6s that are added in as a cofactor because it's so important for so many different things. And then the next thing you know, they're overdosing on that. So then what they do is go, you're manifesting with symptoms of B12 deficiency, which is pins and needles, fatigue. We've got some weird shit going on your blood cells and all that sort of stuff. And then what we'll do is prescribe them some B12. Typically, over the years, what's happened with the B12 supplements, it's gone from just giving them a multi that's got the B12 into it, now using these really flash fandango, like sublingual sources of B12.
liposomal
And this
lozenges.
is where I got confused because I want to talk a little bit about the absorption of B12 and how it moves through the body because it's very complicated. It's very confusing to me. Which sucks because my job was supposed to be fixing this sort of stuff.
Yeah.
But there's weird stuff in it. Like, for example, and what confuses me the most, I'll just basically, to me, it's like nature says we should just eat shit. This is what but no, it just does not make sense. Like, think about it, this is what confuses me, all right? And I'll be honestly tell you that this is what makes me not understand this sublingual stuff and all the different forms of supplementation and the plants, because the absorption, there's a thing called intrinsic factor that lives in around our stomach that hates acid, but it's there. Anyway, we'll get back to that. So the intrinsic factor is needed to absorb the B12. So it's the transporter to carry the B12 into the blood.
Well, there's a couple of different transporters. So
Well, there's the TC 1s, 2s, and 3s.
Yeah.
But the big point, just hang on, this is a bit that confuses me because I'm going to let you be a hero in a second and correct all of my dumb assumptions. But for the people out there, they can relate to why I'm confused, I'm hoping. So intrinsic factors up the top, all right? Most the microbial production and the B12 made from fermentation of plant material happens in the last part of our bowel. So in the large intestine, we have a heap of B12 in poop, more B12 in poop than we have in the food we eat. So it's like really spins me out to think that the B12, that naturally the body makes the B12 right at the end, but we absorb it at the top. And that bit to me goes, that is a very strange kind of process. But then we get told that the best way to supplement B12 is by holding it under your tongue. So, and then they talk about the intrinsic factors and stuff. So let's quickly talk about the absorption of B12 and the different forms, and you go first.
Okay. So in terms of the digestion, you'll eat a steak or you'll eat some kind of a protein food. Your stomach acid and gastric protease enzymes breaks it down in the stomach and then liberates the vitamin B12.
Yes.
Then that vitamin B12 gets bound still in the stomach to
Yep.
haptocorrin. So haptocorrin is a protein that is very very stable. I think it's a glycosylated protein, which makes it very stable so stomach acid cannot break it down.
Yeah.
So then when that moves to the small intestine, the pancreatic protease enzymes degrades it because it's very sensitive.
Yep.
So it liberates the B12 again. B12 binds to intrinsic factor.
Yes.
In the small intestine.
In the alkaline environment.
That's right.
Yeah.
So intrinsic factor is very resistant against pancreatic enzymes, doesn't get broken down by pancreatic enzymes.
Mm-hmm.
Then that gets carried through the small intestine. Gets
so the B12's attached to it?
B12 is attached to it.
Yep.
In the distal part of the ileum, so if you look at your small intestine, right at the end of your small intestine is the ileum.
Yep.
And so when it gets to the ileum, it gets attracted to an intrinsic factor transcobalamin I think it's transcobalamin receptor.
Yeah.
So this receptor will only accept B12 bound to intrinsic factor. It will not accept just intrinsic factor on its own or just B12 on its own. So it docks in that receptor. From that receptor, it gets absorbed into the cell.
Mm-hmm.
Inside in that intestinal epithelial cell. Inside the cell, it enters the lysosome in the cell where it starts to dissolve the intrinsic factor or unbinds it. So now you have free vitamin B12. That vitamin B12 will then go on to do exactly all the stuff we had on this thing. It'll first go to energy ATP production in that Krebs cycle. Whatever is left will go into the methylation cycle. And then whatever else is left then gets bound to transcobalamin, goes into the bloodstream, gets bound to transcobalamin, and from there on it gets carried to all the other kinds of cells where it kind of does exactly the same thing that we just kind of explained.
Yep.
So the transcobalamins, the three main transporters for B12 is the haptocorin, the intrinsic factor, and the transcobalamin 2. So they're the three ones that carries vitamin B12 right from the beginning, right till the end, till it gets to the cells.
Yeah,
That's basic absorption.
But
yeah.
that's assuming that we've taken B12 in orally.
Yes.
Yeah.
You have to.
So
That's through food.
exactly. But what food?
Well, protein.
Animal
meat,
protein.
Yeah, animal
so
proteins.
if I'm not eating animal protein that actually has B12 in it, so if the food doesn't have the B12 in it, if it's just the plant matter that ferments, that uses the microbes to make the B12 in the large intestine, that's right at the end. That's
doesn't
past,
get absorbed.
That's past the oral, the stomach and everything. Now, 95% of the bile salts and that sort of stuff are then reabsorbed through the enterohepatic circulation. Only 5% of our bile salts are lost. 95% is recirculated, which does include that B12. And then it gets dropped back down through, so the enterohepatic circulation will pick up those nutrients, the bile pigments and bile salts, everything out of the lower part of the large intestine, because the cecum that we're talking about in the absorption, that's like, where the appendix is. That's like right at the start of the large intestine. That's before the B12 is actually made.
That's right.
So it's absorbed before it's made.
That's right.
So
do you want to know why?
If we make it soon, I'm still trying to get my head around this. if we make it in the last part of our bowel, then the enterohepatic circulation can reabsorb it, put it into the liver. It comes out through.
No,
so
it doesn't get reabsorbed in the large bowel.
So if I'm not eating my animal sources of B12...
I've got the answer. There's an evolutionary quirk that's what is answering...
That's a terrible title. Steve, you just
I
stole someone's article there.
I did. And this is why we need to eat B12, and this is why we're not herbivores anymore.
Steve.
I know. I'll get the emails.
Well, we can just say hippos, elephants, rabbits, they all eat their own poop in order to get B12 from their feces.
Well, who's the dickhead now then?
Into this. I'm just saying what nature does.
Yeah.
I'm not saying herbivorism is bad.
I know I'm upsetting feelings, but the facts don't care about the feelings.
Come on. All right. No, I'm serious.
You want to know the answer?
No, yes, I do. I genuinely do. I'm starting to get a little bit frustrated because it fucking doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It's got to work. I mean, seriously. I mean, people eat plants and live on plant-based diets. And most of them B12 deficient, admittedly, but...
Yes.
I mean, there's got to be a way. Like, tell me, Steve. You can tell me the answer then.
Sure.
And your answers can't just be eat meat. All right? Tell me the answer, but it can't be just eat meat.
You don't have to just eat meat. You can eat eggs or any other animal protein.
Oh.
Yeah, it could be yogurt, dairy, things like that.
But no, I choose to be plant man.
You can choose to be plant man.
Well, then you have to eat fortified foods.
Yeah. If I was plant man, I'd be happily eat my own poo, wouldn't I?
These days, plant man can survive because there's a lot of B12 fortified foods. Not the right sort of B12, not my favourite B12.
No, but this doesn't make sense, Steve.
All right, do you want me to tell you why?
How do the cows get it?
Because they absorb it out of their cecum, their large intestine's different structure. Same with sheep. Remember, sheep have 4 stomachs. Well, we're comparing ourselves to completely different species that absorb things completely differently.
Yeah, we're
You got to remember,
omnivores.
sheep regurgitate their food to re-chew it again. You know, they do things completely different.
So you're saying if we eat vegan animals, it's okay?
It's absolutely fine. You can eat vegan animals. I do. They all are
Don't
vegan.
giggle like that. You sound evil.
Except for sharks, they all are vegan.
I do. Oh, right.
You know when you have you know the stomach, right? It's got a top
yeah.
part. It's called the fundus, right? The top part. And that's the part that expands when you eat too much. And you get
really?
this big blood. So what the doctor's going to do is cut that out. Because then you
Why
can't,
would
your
the bottom
stomach can't...
slip down? That doesn't make
Oh,
sense.
because that's got tubing at the bottom, the duodenum and shit. So they cut out the top with the fundus part, and guess what's made there? Intrinsic factor.
Oh, bugger me.
So of course, everybody who has gastric bypass surgery needs injections of B12.
Oh, wow.
Because unless you take 1,000 milligrams of B12 a day, which is they think is just enough,
1,000 milligrams or micrograms?
1,000 micrograms.
Oh,
right?
yeah, cool.
1,000 micrograms was just enough when you had bypass
Wow.
to get you need 1,000 or you need injections. That's how important the intrinsic factor is.
Yeah, wow.
So that's why what Elizma was saying is dead correct, because you need the B12 in your stomach to bind with the intrinsic factor. It can't be made down further.
Oh, my
Because
God.
without intrinsic factor, you're screwed. Another way you're screwed is if you get an autoimmune disease that causes pernicious anemia.
Yeah.
And that attacks the fundus and the intrinsic factor, and you will get pernicious anemia. And that's the genetic form of pernicious
What about
anemia.
acid, stomach acid
So
inhibitors?
proton pump inhibitors,
Yep.
H2 receptor inhibitors, they will kind of, is that what it is?
Yeah,
that right?
H2 histamine receptor pump
So they
inhibitors.
will kind of reduce the absorption of
Yep.
vitamin B12.
Yep.
And there was also your metformin. I think
Yep.
metformin affects the intestinal kind of microbiota, which
It
kind of
increases
like
Akkermansia, which depletes B12.
which depletes B12. And then there was also like there's certain antibiotics that can also affect like the metabolism of vitamin B12 as well.
Sulfur-based ones, yeah.
Yeah.
This is so confusing for me still.
Okay.
Because the plant versus the animal stuff.
Yes.
Because the problem that I'm really having, and I'm not saying it's because I don't understand the biochemistry. I just don't. The data seems very peculiar, because when they talk about the animal ones, we're talking about these forms of B12 the body knows what to do with. All of a sudden they talk about the plant ones and they start saying like nori sheets are a good source. All of a sudden they stop talking about these specific forms of cobalamins that we can understand, and they just start talking about generic terms like cobalamins and coronoids and these weird. And then they show that it definitely increases blood levels, and the data for the plant stuff is old, and it also shows that it's basically can confirm that it may increase blood levels. But when we search for data to show does it actually work like B12, though, it just doesn't.
No, because coronoids is just, cobalamins are just part of coronoids.
Yeah.
So there's a whole bunch of other coronoids as well.
And if
that's
it's
not
oxidized and
cobalamins.
broken down and all that sort of stuff, well,
Incredibly.
then it can just gum up the works. And if we don't understand what form it is, but it's not that, like, it wouldn't help us to go through and analyze these plants and say, we know it contains a percentage of the good forms, the methylcobalamin or something, if the rest of it is loaded up with oxidized other dodgy forms of cobalamins.
Yeah.
Do we have those other dodgy forms of cobalamins in the animals as well? Do we know? Are they?
No, because they're not made they're not in the animals.
They're incorporated into the tissue of the animal
A
protein?
little
or?
bit, but the ratios of them are completely out. Like in the plant ones, you get 10 times more of the. It depends on the plant.
Yeah.
But in spirulina, I remember this one. You get 10 times more of the bad,
dodgy one.
Dodgy. We'll just call it dodgy.
Yeah.
Cobalamin compared to the active one, because bacteria does make B12.
Yeah.
But it's just the wrong type for us humans.
Oh, okay.
Because evolutionary speaking, we need the stomach to interact with the B12. So we need to eat the B12 in here. We can't make it down further.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
See,
the
this
intrinsic
is-
factor. That's the catch.
But
You
also,
need an intrinsic factor.
but also the bacteria low down. I think they can make something like 8 different types of coronoids, and a lot of that is actually more for themselves. That's just for their own
Of course they do.
metabolism.
Yeah.
It's got really nothing to do, with us so much. It's not really providing us so much with B12. It's also to do with gene switching and things like that. I think there was 25% of bacteria in the gut can actually produce vitamin B12, and over 80% of bacteria in the gut actually use that B12. So 25% produce it, for the other 80% to kind of use it in metabolism. Now, if you are not getting enough B12 from your diet or absorbing it, it means that these bacteria have to spend a lot of more energy in making B12.
Okay.
If you get adequate amounts of B12 in, then the bacteria, and some of that travels down further down, they have to expend less energy. They conserve energy because now they don't have to make as much vitamin B12.
Yeah, wow.
It's interesting, isn't it?
So if you're not eating animal sources of B12, eggs and liver and meat and dairy or whatever, and you're measuring your blood levels, you really need to be doing those extra tests, looking for the homocysteine, the MCV,
definitely.
and insist that homocysteine, $25, do it yourself if a doctor won't do it, and get those other tests done to see if you've got to make sure that B12 is actually being utilised by the body to be in a useful form. Otherwise, you're just filling up your blood with a dodgy form and tricking yourself into thinking you're not B12 deficient.
That's
And I would
exactly
even
right.
add the holotranscobalamin on there as well, because holotranscobalamin is vitamin B12 bound to transcobalamin.
Okay.
And transcobalamin will only bind to the active form of vitamin B12.
Oh.
Whereas if you look in the gastric, what Steve was talking about, inactive and active forms, the vegan forms and the animal protein forms, is the very first step that haptocorin in the stomach will bind to both active and inactive forms.
Yeah.
So if you're eating a lot of, let's say, mainly plant-based proteins, then they're going to take up all that space in the haptocorin and not leave enough space for the active guys to kind of bind to.
Yeah.
Which means in your bloodstream, you're likely going to have much lower levels of B12 in the holotranscobalamin form, not total vitamin B12 serum.
Yeah.
So total vitamin B12 serum, like Steve said, means nothing because it includes both active, inactive, bound, unbound, oxidized,
That's wrong, man.
And I'll just elaborate on it a bit, but that's exactly correct. So this is why you need to do all the tests. Basically, if we can just have a close-up here, you see there's your B12 there, cobalamin, and there's adenosylcobalamin and methylcobalamin. Methylcobalamin turns homocysteine into methionine, and the adenosylcobalamin turns methylmalonic acid into succinyl-CoA. So that's why you measure methylmalonic acid and homocysteine to measure the two different types of B12, the two active types. So that's why you need these comprehensive blood tests, not just B12, because as I said before in a previous study, they increased their B12, but their pernicious anemia got worse, which is a direct marker of B12 as well. So pernicious anemia is another autoimmune disease too.
Yeah, right.
And so you can get your fundus attacked, and that stops that, and therefore you can't absorb B12 whatsoever.
Huh.
And they need injections and all sorts of things, because that's why B12 needs to interact in the stomach before it can be absorbed. That's why you have to eat it. You can't just make it downstairs.
And there's a there's a strange concentration gradient thing as well. So like it's one of those things that like it goes from like high in the stomach and then slightly lower in the blood and then slightly lower in the cells. So it's like if you go through and screw around with that concentration gradient. That's why I found in my clinic that people, you send them off, they got all these signs of B12 deficiency, and you'd send them off to the doctor to get it tested, and then before they'd come back, they'd had a shot. They'd gone through and had a B12 injection. They come back, man, I feel terrible. And then most naturopaths would say, oh, it's a healing crisis or something like that.
Yeah.
But there seems to be this weird withdrawal. There's this like almost a rebound effect with a mega dosing of B12 where you get a big bolus into the blood, and it's like almost I imagine it like a ripple, like say you drop a pebble, the ripples go out and then they come back. So imagine that the big bolus in the blood and it shifts over to the other areas to fix up this concentration gradient and then swishes back again.
Yeah.
That's probably a dumbass way of looking at it, but that's kind of the way it makes people feel.
It definitely makes sense. I see the same thing in my practice as well, Matt. It's like a lot of people do get these injections, and then what's was supposed to make them feel better makes them feel worse. I found that sometimes, well, this is just again speculation, but the two intramuscular forms of vitamin B12 is usually either cyanocobalamin or methylcobalamin.
Yeah.
So if they used cyanocobalamin,
straight up.
well,
That'll
that
explain
may
it.
not be
Yeah,
a
yeah.
good thing. And the other thing is also, if you have a lot of oxidative stress in your body, then there's also very likely a big likelihood that you'll be oxidizing a lot of that vitamin B12, which means you're not really getting the benefit from it.
And it
now
can't
you
be
just
converted once it's oxidized.
Yeah.
Hey, it's just like a damaged form.
Well, that's the thing. That's the interesting thing. In order to kind of take it, once it's oxidized, because that's kind of part of this whole methylation cycle, right? As you use it. Now, the enzyme that has to kind of, it doesn't really have it on there, but you need actually SAMe. So you know that methyl donor that B12 has to make.
Yeah.
You need that methyl donor to get that vitamin B12 from the oxidized form into the reduced form. So it's a catch-22.
So mega dosing of B12 is not a good idea, even in a major deficiency. We're better off still because it is such a low dose thing. Like we're talking about microgram dosing. What did you say? It's like 3 micrograms all you need a day?
2.4 for adults in Australia, but less for children, less than 1 microgram.
I think in the supplements, it's often like 200 or 400 in a multi, but then people go up to 1,000 micrograms typically in a single B12 supplement. So why sublingual? Why do they say sublingual's better if all the transporters are down here?
Well,
is that what you said before about it goes into a different form inside the cells?
Yeah. So inside the cells is when it converts into either methyl or adenosine cobalamin.
Yeah. But they did a study measuring blood levels after it, and it was basically said the conclusion's simple. A dose of 500 micrograms of cobalamin, they just used cobalamin, was given either sublingual or orally is effective at correcting deficiency, and there's no significant difference between concentrations
whether
of
it was
either group.
sublingual or oral.
Yeah, because it's still got in there because you can either sublingually absorb it or you can use intrinsic factor. Now, if you had, say,
so you can sublingually absorb. I know we make a little bit of B12 from the bacteria in our mouth.
Yeah.
Does that? So we can just absorb B12 sublingually without needing it to be bound to an intrinsic factor transporter.
If you do it sublingually, that's right. Or you can use intrinsic factor. Either way works. But if you had, say, gastric...
but it won't be liberated out of the protein in your mouth otherwise, huh? So in the sublingual form is just pure B12. It's by itself, so it can be absorbed. Where normally the B12 that you'd be eating as part of a meat would be bound into something. It's got to go down to the acid to be liberated. Yeah. So if it's already liberated, we can absorb it out of our mouth.
Absolutely, but not you can't sublingually absorb steak. For example, that'd be a bit weird too. Chunk of steak.
Oh, and it tastes so good. Why would you do that?
I know, you just chew it. It's very interesting because that study surprised me because I thought it'd be slightly better or something.
Well, they advertise that it is. So you'd assume that there's a reason why.
And they used 500 micrograms. Remember, the absorption, the more you give, the less is absorbed. Like iron from our last podcast. So if you take 5 micrograms, it's absorbed a little bit. If you take 1,000, just a little bit more will be absorbed. Yeah, right. So it's that big concentration gradient. Because this stuff's so cheap, it's relatively easy. Now, the problem with megadosing is if you megadose cyanide cobalamin, because cyanide is, of course, as you know, very toxic.
Maybe a tiny amount, wouldn't it? I mean, we're talking about microgram doses of the molecule with a part of it being cyanide. How does it compare to where do we find cyanide? Mushrooms and apple seeds or something?
Yeah, apple seeds. Yeah,
poison typically.
In broccoli too.
Broccoli? How does it compare to that? I mean, is it...
it's just another source. You just don't want too much of it.
Yeah.
It's funny because cyanide and poisons have been used as treatments for many, many years. Oh, yeah. The one for anemia. Can I take it back to 1915?
If you do the...
Osler, which was a famous medical book. Yeah, there's a famous medical book in 1915. Described the treatment of megaplastic anemia. And one of the treatments was, of course, rest, go out in the sun, eat plenty of good food, and take a few drops of arsenic to treat your megaplastic anemia.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Do you know how it worked?
No, yes.
It killed cells in your bodies and they released B12, so you felt better.
Wow.
That's an interesting point because that was one of the other things that they found in the vegans that with a B12 deficiency, they shed their microvilli out of their digestive tract, which are really high in B12. So they can actually shed their gut lining so that the body can break down the gut lining to liberate B12 to correct a deficiency. Yes. And if you're not eating enough, the microbes will do the same. So your microbiome that's supposed to be building villi and in building the integrity of your gut wall, if they are deficient in B12, they will actually eat your gut wall and liberate the B12.
I'm actually glad that you mentioned that because...
I'm glad you're glad.
Because talking about gut bacteria and when they need an energy source and they kind of like have to look for energy is the carotenoids. So those vitamin B12, the vitamin B12 that they produce that helps their enzymes to function, kind of helps to break down ethanolamine. I can never pronounce these things. Ethanolamine, which is part of the membrane of the phospholipid. You know that your phosphatidyl ethanolamine, that is part of the cell membrane.
Yeah.
So they actually use an enzyme called ethanolamine ammonia lyase, which is B12 dependent, to break down that cell membrane on the gut lining if they need food, if they get starved from food.
Wow.
So, you
Yeah,
know,
the body, and you've got to remember, you
just
store,
digest
if you're B12 replete, remember it'll take 2 or 3 years for you to deplete it.
Yeah.
So this is another thing where someone goes, say, straight vegan, they go for a year and they go, I'm fine, I don't
feel
need
great, usually. Tell everyone.
And the B12 levels will last for 2 to 3 years. So yeah,
Oh,
they
wow.
tell everyone. So it's a little bit of a, you have to be vegan for at least 3 years. You know, if you've got replete B12 for it to show. It's one of the B vitamins that are stored in the body. Wow. So it's another little trick where a vegan will say, no, I don't need B12. Never, I've been doing this for a year.
And it takes ages to.
Yeah,
right.
And then of course they might have a piece of bread that has B12 supplemented in it, or they may
or a
have,
shot.
yeah, or a shot, or they may have
Or a
taken a
supplement.
taps.
Yeah.
You know, I
Yeah.
just take natural multivitamins. Well, it's got plenty of B12 if they're, you know, good. You know,
Yeah.
so B12 is rarely deficient. Now, pernicious anemia is where you get the deficiencies, autoimmune diseases. It affects about 0.5% of the population.
Yeah, wow.
So that's a dangerous one. That's the one you get real serious fatigue that's not relieved by sleep.
Oh, wait. And this is kind of cool. So with B12, so I want to say, if you're eating an animal-based product that contains B12 in one of those forms that our body can utilize and absorb, we'll get it. If you're not eating those things, then your body has to work a little bit extra hard to. I still don't know the answer, guys. There is no answer then. So if you're vegan, you're just going to struggle with B12.
well, if you're vegan, your bacteria will still make vitamin B12
Yeah.
from all the plant fibers and things that you're eating. But then there's all your body, the gut bacteria will most likely use that B12 for enzymes to break down your gut lining further in order to kind of feed them.
Themselves.
And then you would still tend to be B12 deficient because you're not getting anything from the top side
Yeah.
or absorbing anything from the top side. So your bacteria will take care of themselves. They couldn't care less about
yeah.
you, but
There was a study that investigated you with vegans
Oh,
and
yeah.
B12 and their cardiovascular health.
Yeah.
And they found they had poor cardiovascular health. Their intermediate thickness in the carotid artery, we can measure the arteries. It
Yeah.
did become thicker, which means there is some vascular damage if your B12 is low in vegans.
Yeah,
So
right.
they have like fine cholesterol, and they'll, you know, a
Yeah.
lot of vegans, you know,
But maybe higher homocysteine,
Yeah,
lower
yeah.
antioxidant defense and that sort of
exactly,
stuff.
and lower neurotransmitter functioning, and you know, often less energy because of that.
And often leaky gut wall
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
leaky gum.
Yep.
The
yep.
leaky gum is a significant
Yeah.
problem. A lot of people don't acknowledge that gum is part of the gut, and then you get a leaky gut, you get leaky gum, and we know oral health contributes to cardiovascular
Yeah.
disease
Exactly.
so
So,
much.
they develop atherosclerosis. So it's something you've got to be a little bit careful of. But if you want to go vegan, there's a lot of benefits for it. You're typically not going to eat McDonald's and, you know, some of the junk
you're going
food.
to eat more vegetables.
Oh, no, I'm
Yeah.
only talking
Yeah.
about B12. Like, I'm only. This is the one thing out of all the nutrients, you know, like we talk about vitamin Ds, we talk about other potential. I'm not. Vegans got no concerns really with protein. That's easy. That's heavily abundant. Most of their other minerals are there.
Tons
They
of
can
minerals.
source iron. You can get everything else. I still have never come across the answer for vegans with B12. I know because the answer that's supplied is full of other forms of cobalamin with no evidence to suggest that those cobalamins can convert efficiently.
Well, the opposite
So
evidence.
I'm still at a bit of a loss. I think with the vegan B12 thing, it's going to be a matter of. It can't just be supplementation because we evolved without supplementation. But I suppose we evolved by eating the meats.
Well, but we evolved to become omnivores.
Yeah, which we are.
That's our digestive system.
Yeah,
So
as opposed to herbivores.
Maybe you were herbivores at one
But
stage. I don't know
insects.
much about evolution.
Does this might go back to my theory that there is no true herbivore because of insects? Because anyone that sits there and grazing, and not anyone, anyone in nature, like all the animals that eat plants, eat a shitload of insects.
There's only one. I
There
can
is
think of.
massive amounts of insects. And I used to do a lot of work with animals, and in particular racehorses, and used to find massive problems if they were taken away from their source of insects. They had to eat insects. They had bulk amount of insects within and bugs and all that sort of stuff with the plant material. And in nature, that would happen. And they don't. It's not just, they didn't consciously avoid that because it had a soul or something. It was like this is the thing they would go out of their way for. to eat, to go and find the insects, and they would eat sections of, they would graze in sections where they're getting extra of these animals in amongst their plant. So I don't know of any herbivore on Earth that would pick out the other little bits and pieces of animal critters that were in amongst their plant material.
No higher form animal, like the prokaryotes are the only ones I can think of that are true vegans.
Yeah.
Because they're the first cells.
The ones that made B12.
Yeah. Yeah, they're the ones that made B12 themselves. But
We've done a full loop, 3.8 billion years.
Yeah, I know. But
we did that in an hour.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about horses and that, because when you said that, I thought, oh, what about
because there's no chitin. Again, back to that hydroxyproline and that sort of stuff. That they get the chitin, hydroxyprolines, and that out of the exoskeletons of the insects. They get a lot of other nutrients out of that are not found in plant. And when you take them away from that, they disintegrate terribly, very quickly.
It's fascinating.
So that's
interesting.
I don't know. We wouldn't know. I wish I'd thought about that earlier before the podcast, because we're going to have to Google B12 content of insects. And my thinking then is, if you're a herbivore in nature, then there would be a large consumption of whether the monkeys that they'd eat all the insects. Remember that Medicine Man movie with Sean Connery?
That was a great
and it turned out to be the insects. And the thing.
Ants,
I don't think that was factually like a historical
the cure for cancer
thing. But
ants and sugar.
Yeah, the big point is that we're very, when we go exclusively, I'm a vegan because that's natural or something like that. We'll do it naturally. Naturally, you'd be eating things straight, unprocessed, unrefined, potentially full of all sorts of artifacts and contaminants that may actually be providing the nutrients that you do not get in your diet without that accidental consumption of insects.
Do you want to know?
Insects should be allowed in a vegan diet then, in my theory. In a herbivore diet.
There was a study done in Nutrition Reviews that measured B12 in vegans and said, well, are they deficient really? And this study came back with...
Did he say it like that?
Yes, he did.
Really?
His name is Roman, actually. And
it sounds like he would have said it like that.
Yes. He said 62% among pregnant women were deficient, 25% and amongst adults, almost 86% among children, 21 to 41% among adolescents, and 11 to 90% among the elderly. So that's quite a significant percentage of B12 deficiency in vegans, isn't it?
That's huge.
It's rounded off to 50.
And it's interesting the children. Am I correct? That was about 80-something%. That was the
21
highest.
to 40. Oh, the adolescents. Yeah, children 86% because children are terrible.
Well, and it's also probably because I'm just going to just make an assumption that the mother is probably a vegan, so the kids are being, they're growing up as vegans, and that heptacorin protein that helps with B12 absorption is in breast milk as well. So that's how babies kind of there has to be B12 binds to that, goes into the breast milk. So very likely that they didn't get enough B12 during those early years of breastfeeding as well.
Yeah. So it's pretty interesting.
That's
so like
true.
You get this kid that's like a vegan because I don't want to eat mum's steak. Yeah, and then chicken nuggets come out and say, man, no vegan today. Yeah. But when they're vegan, otherwise it's basically in their mind it means I like to eat bread.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So sometimes it's hard you can't do that sort of stuff properly with children in many cases, Yeah. Because it's hard work sometimes.
So it is quite significant, B12 deficiency in vegans. It's So be aware of it.
So what you're looking for to fix it in a supplement, the natural forms, which I keep going back to because I just keep low self-esteem and confidence. Methylcobalamin, the adenosine are the preferred forms. Yeah. We like the methylcobalamin because it involves itself directly into the methyl cycles if you seem to present that symptom picture. Yeah. But either one of those forms are in the natural form that the body can actually utilise. Whether it's in a sublingual form or just in another form to be taken orally doesn't matter, according to the research, really.
It doesn't matter.
The combinations, is there anything in that you wouldn't have B12 combined with? Because I know it doesn't like acid, so it doesn't like sitting in an acidic mix, meaning that if you were to have in a tablet, so if you were to have B12 with some vitamin C and lipoic acid or something like that in a capsule, and we eat that's no real problem, because sitting in a powder, they're in there, they're kind of okay. If I was to then take that out of that powder and make it into a liquid, it'd only last about 10 minutes before the acid breaks down that B12. So B12 within a matrix of other nutrients, it's fine. stacks really well with the
I can't
phthalates
think
and
of any
that.
reason why it can't. The only thing that I'll point out is the methyl and the adenosine are certainly the best active forms. And those who do, there are some people who don't do so well with methylated nutrients for various reasons.
Oh, yeah.
And so in those cases, I usually recommend using the hydroxycobalamin.
Oh, right.
Because hydroxycobalamin same as cyanocobalamin, can go either
Go
way.
both ways.
Yeah,
So
righto.
the body will decide, do I want to make more
yeah.
adenosine, do I want to make more methyl?
Yeah. What about a mix? Do many people do the two, combine the
Yeah,
two
yeah.
natural forms and just go with a bit of
You can get
methyl,
them
bit of
overseas
this?
where they
Yeah.
mix them.
Yeah, I don't know what the legalities of those
No,
ones
we'll
in
work it
Australia
out.
are. Yeah, we
We'll
know.
find a solution to this problem for the poor
Absolutely.
herbivores.
I think they usually do, they'll usually have a bigger methyl cobalamin portion than an adenosyl cobalamin.
So what else do we? So we know how to fix it.
Yep.
Pretty much, you just supplement with it. If you've had a gastric bypass, if you've decided to do a B12 bypass by going vegan, if you've lost your fundus from autoimmunity, all that sort of stuff, then you've got to supplement some sort of B12, sublingual or in a thing. It shouldn't matter too much.
Yep.
Injections if you're really low, but just be prepared for a potential hangover, washout period,
Yeah.
smacking you down a little bit. That's not
because
necessary
they usually
detox.
give cobalamin in the doctor surgeries, which means it has to be converted then to the active ones.
Yeah.
And it can be,
Yeah.
but it just takes time, and
Yeah.
you probably get that
No,
lingering.
well, so I think that's enough for the B12. I think we need to work more on a solution for this, because I think there is still so much misinformation out there. So many people are just reading old data that hasn't been updated regarding, in particular, plant material.
Yes.
And I don't really want to. I think we need to now do our podcast on the carnivore diet,
Yes.
because I think that could be really, really interesting. Because at the
Yeah.
end of this, I'm starting to think, do I need to eat my fruit and veggies anymore?
Absolutely
When you say
not.
carnivore, you mean like pure carnivore? Like there was a
it's a
footballer that
thing.
came out that said that
There's
he was
a carnivore-
they
there's
do.
who's that doctor? There's some doctor dude, some carnivore guy. There's a few of them around.
we got to do that.
But it's fairly new.
Yeah, I always want to know. I don't
Yeah, me
care. I'm
too.
not promoting any of these things, because I just like to understand stuff and just rip it to bits. Because every time we do that, we kind of find that the natural way is somewhere in between.
Yeah.
So like there's three truths to every story.
Yep.
So and you'll find that in nature it's kind of like it's kind of common sensey things. There's a certain amount of food that's available. Things change with seasons. Yeah, it's like I think we'll end up somewhere in the middle again.
I'll tell you
But
what-
I'd love to see these extremes, because in the extremes you can learn so much.
One thing for the vegans is, and I don't know, there's different styles of vegans, but fish roe, the eggs of fish, is extremely rich
not
in
vegan.
B12. Yeah, I know. I
That's
don't know.
vegetarian. Or something,
Yeah,
or
I know.
Pescatarian.
There's pescatarians and that
Yeah.
sort of thing. So good old vegetarians should be fine with B12. It's the vegans, the strict vegans.
Exactly. The vegans
know,
that have excluded
no.
anything from an animal or
Exactly.
anything with a soul or whatever.
Yeah, it's funny. The richest source, of course, is beef liver. That's got huge amounts, and they used to call it liver factor, B12, before they called it B12.
Is that right?
Yeah, that's how they used to treat people with pernicious anemia, with liver factor. Tasted
that's
like
cool. Liver.
like crap. Actually, the guy who formulated the mathematics for Albert Einstein had pernicious anemia, and he was treated with liver factor.
Well, that's another interesting fact, Steve.
I've got to give you guys a useless information at the end of the podcast.
All right, Dan, what's yours? Give us a bit of useless information.
I've got none this time.
No, it's all useful.
I know.
See what I mean, Steve? I don't have anything useless either. I don't think it is necessary to finish things with a useless piece of information. Just trying to make us feel inferior because we don't know something stupid.
Oh, this is something you never need
Don't
to
let
know.
him bring you down. And
Something you never need to know about that, is it? It's funny.
No.
Just useless information.
Well, that'll do, won't it?
Yep.
Do you
I
reckon
think
we've
that'll
had
do.
enough?
I reckon we've done
I reckon
well.
everyone's sick of hearing us.
That's
Yep.
right.
Well, thanks for listening, and
Yeah.
thanks for putting up with Steve.
Yeah.
And learning from Elizma.
Yes, that's about it.
And we'll see you next week about something else that we'll talk about in depth about something.
Carnival
That's
diet.
right.
See ya.
That'll
Bye.
do, won't it? All right, hurry.
Oh, no, hold on.
You are fucking full of
Hold
shit
on.
right
So-
now.
No.
This is Steve-O trying to be funny.
So if I say-
can tell this is Steve-O trying to be funny. And call someone that cares.
Yeah, 50 cent piece.
Hello?
That's right.
Oh, and then she starts the giggles again, which adds the extra 5 fucking minutes. Let's just wait for Brooko to... You want to tell us about your date while we wait?
No.
That'll all stop us from laughing.